Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's a little bit past 3 o'clock, and it's a Friday afternoon, so that means that it's time for the Hot Politics Lab. And today we are very happy and honored to host Professor Ursula Hess from Humboldt University in Berlin. Why is that? Well, because with Maaike Hohmann entering our lab 2 years ago, we have been talking a lot about facial mimicry, and Professor Hess's work is really central in understanding facial mimicry and the social contextualities of these. She has a PhD from Dartmouth College and has a long history of publishing influential papers on the role of facial mimicry, and I'm really curious about this talk today, so I'm not going to talk any longer but give the floor to Professor Hess, who will talk for 25 minutes more or less, and then there's time for Q&A. As always, you can type this in the chat function, and then Gijs Schumacher will read these questions out, and we'll have a conversation about them. All right, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for these kind words, and thank you very much for inviting me. Obviously, it would have been even better if you had invited me to Amsterdam, but I'll do my best from the comfort of my own home. What I want to talk about, as was announced, is the notion of facial mimicry in social contexts. Well, you all know what mimicry is. Mimicry is imitation of the nonverbal behavior of others, and actually journalists really like to catch moments when politicians mimic each other. These are the Canadian and British foreign ministers at the time, and this is Guido Westerwelle and Angela Merkel, and you can see that they have great similarity in posture and facial expression. Facial mimicry is a more specific situation where we actually mimic the emotional expression of another person. This has some extra interesting features because emotional expressions have their own social signal value. That is, for instance, if I look at the happy facial expression, then, or to some degree also sad facial expressions, those are affiliative signals. Whereas if I look at an expression of anger or disgust, this is not very affiliative. If somebody were to greet me saying hello, then I don't think we would feel very invited. So the tradition of mimicry research for a long time was very much like the tradition of emotion communication research in general, in that there was this notion there is an emotional state which the person expresses, and then there's the observer, and the observer sort of labels that state. Yes. And because of the basic notion that what's really important is the expression, people were trying to show just the expression, no context. This is a classic stimulus as social vision people have often used, or visual perception people. And in fact, this is already a total failure, because if I have an expression such as this, I can at the very least draw information on a very important social context factor, and that social group membership. Whom am I talking to? Who is my interaction partner? And even that picture has information about the likely gender of the person, the approximate age of that person, and information about ethnicity. And we know from quite a few studies that social group membership, and especially notions of in-group and out-group, are very important when it comes to the presence and absence of mimicry. So this is already a failure, but what is still lacking others in social group membership is the social information that we garner from knowing what the context of the interaction is. The context of the interaction influences both the emotional state. For instance, we might laugh differently at the flat joke of our boss and the flat joke of our best friend. And it also has an important impact on how we interpret what we are seeing. So what I'm going to look at today is essentially situational context. That is, what is the specific situation in which something happens. Before I talk about two types of this context, the social interaction and the actual context in terms of what type of event happens, I would just briefly remind everyone of the mimicry as a social act theory that I have developed with Agneta Fischer from Amsterdam, whom you all know. And our idea is that mimicry is an automatic process, facial mimicry is an automatic process, but it's nonetheless goal dependent. What I mean by this is people mimic when they have the goal to communicate understanding, that they understand the other person, in order to foster affiliation and regulate interactions. And this leads us to a number of corollaries. First of all, that we don't mimic specific muscle movement, but we mimic what we understand about the other's emotions, because understanding is what we want to signal. I'm not going to talk about that today, though. The other issue is that we in particular mimic when we want to affiliate, that we are less likely to mimic antagonistic signals because mimicry is intended to foster affiliation, and antagonism is not the best way to foster affiliation. And mimicry has an impact on social interaction quality. So where comes context in when we're thinking about those corollaries? Well, first of all, context can to some degree change the perception of the emotion and thereby what it is we mimic. If I understand my emotions, what the other person says feels differently, I would mimic something different. And context also changes the perception of the person and thereby whether we want to affiliate. And why that is, I go into a little bit more detail in a little moment. First, I want to briefly mention how we do measure facial mimicry traditionally. So let's say until this February, we measure facial mimicry particularly using facial imagery. Why? Because facial mimicry tends to be subtle. Here, these two avatars from a series of studies by John Gratch and colleagues show approximately how intense most people would mimic when they see a happy or angry expression. So you can see it, yes, but it's not the most glaringly obvious signal. And because of that, we usually prefer to use facial EMG. Facial EMG has a much better resolution, so we can measure very subtle movements. And we usually measure the movement of the corrugator supercilii, which draws together the eyebrows, of orbicularis oculi and zygomaticus major, which has the two muscles involved in smiling, and the levator labiae superioris, which is the muscle that does a sneer. In the last study that I will show you today, we actually conducted the study online more recently, and we filmed participants' facial expressions and used OpenFace, which is a computer sensing program that allows us to score facial expressions. We still kept, however, to the notion that we measure frowns and smiles for the most part. So, what does context do? The first type of context I would like to look at is the social interaction context, or maybe we could say the effective tone of the interaction. Heidi Mauersberger, now Dr. Heidi Mauersberger, is interested in conflict, and she was looking at conflict interactions And she designed a very, very clever experiment in which participants were interacting with another person. And they were supposed to discuss introducing an organizational measure at the workplace with another person. And because we told them that we didn't know how much background information they had on these measures, we presented them with a number of arguments that could be used to, with regard to these measures. And participants were supposed to click on the argument that they would like to defend and then do so in their own words. But because we knew what argument they were basically making, we could pre-record a whole bunch of answers to these arguments and provide participants with a suitable answer. In all cases, our participants' interaction partners rejected everything they said, but they did so in two very different ways. So these are the concluding remarks.
Ich glaube, ich würde aber trotzdem bei dem bleiben wollen, was ich vorher gesagt habe, einfach weil, ja, das sind so die Argumente, die ich gebracht habe, sind für mich einfach am schlüssigsten und das ist meine Meinung. Und, ja. Und vor allem aber auch, weil die andere Seite dermaßen schwach argumentiert hat, da fand ich jeden Punkt eigentlich schlecht und also da war jetzt nichts, was mich irgendwie überzeugen könnte, die andere Option zu wählen. Nee, also ich bleibe auf jeden Fall bei meiner. Ich glaube,
as we can see, one of these was quite an affiliative way of rejecting everything the other person said, whereas the others sounded quite antagonistic. And our actors were also instructed to have matching facial expressions. So as we can see here, the actors were showing very reduced, in the affiliate context, reduced corrugator and increased orbicularis oculi and zygomaticus major. So they were essentially smiling. And the reversed pattern, which corresponds to a frowny expression, was shown during the antagonistic conflict. Because we had measured AMG in both the participant and the interaction partner, we could actually correlate the match of their expressiveness. So we could assess mimicry through the correlation between the muscle movement of the two interaction partners. What we see here is the Z-scored correlation index and the interaction quality. But if we just look at these clouds of number of points, we see in the affiliative context, interaction quality is generally higher than in the antagonistic context, which may not actually surprise anyone. But if we see, then we see also that in the affiliative context, there's higher values for the mimicry score by and large. But we also see that even in the affiliative context, there is quite a tendency still to mimic the facial expression of the interaction partner, albeit somewhat less. But what's interesting is the effect that this mimicry has. We saw that in the antagonistic context, participants were basically frowning. And in the affiliative context, models were essentially smiling. So when they mimic a smiling model, they must smile. And we see that this increases interaction quality significantly. Interestingly, even so, this is not quite significant, but what we see is, if anything, there's a trend to the opposite when participants mimic the antagonistic interaction partner. So the essentially frowning interaction partner. So this suggests, as we were predicting, that mimicry fosters affiliation, but only if it's mimicry of an affiliative signal. Mimicry of an antagonistic signal does not foster a better interaction quality at all. If anything, it reduces it. The other study I would like to mention is one in which we're looking at situational context. The problem with situations, the situation in which something happens, is that situations can be interpreted very differently depending on who does the interpretation. So we decided to stick with two very iconic contexts: weddings and funerals. Weddings are iconic, happy situations, and there's a clear-cut social norm that says if you're at a wedding, you're supposed to smile. And funerals are iconic, sad situations, and there's a clear-cut social norm that says at a funeral, you should look sad. Yes? So the model that we were looking at in this study was one where we were saying we have a social context which has a clear expressive demand, and we have an expression. And so if the expression doesn't match the demand, we call this expression deviance. And the more deviant an expression it is, the higher is the perceived inappropriateness of the behavior of the person who shows this expression. And this in turn leads to lower perceived closeness to that person. So you report yourself as feeling less close to a person who shows deviance. And this should also lead to less facial mimicry, because if facial mimicry is dependent on you wanting to affiliate, then you don't want to affiliate with that deviant person in front of you. So how did we do this? Well, we showed people little videos. One moment. First, they see the setting, so that they're quite aware of what the setting is. And then they see a person, and that person shows, in this case, a deviant expression. And the other setting we had is a wedding setting. You see everybody else's faces are blurred. So, and here we have the person with her deviant expression. And obviously everybody also saw the expected combination of sad at funeral and happy at weddings. So when we look at the appropriateness rating, so how appropriate is the behavior of that person, we see that those who smile at funerals and look sad at weddings are rated as generally less appropriate in their behavior, even so there are some deviant participants who think that behavior is perfectly fine. Yes. But nonetheless, we find that those who smile at funerals and those that look sad at weddings elicit less feelings of closeness. So participants report feeling less close to them. Even so, here again, there's a few deviants. So the next question that we had was, well, okay, does that now have an impact on mimicry, and what is that impact? Here we have again a mimicry score. We have put it all together, all the muscles were combined into one score that expresses the extent of mimicry. And here we have weddings, and at these weddings we can see here is the closeness score, and green is close and yellow is not close. And we see here is the beginning of when they just see the scene, so there's no mimicry here, and this is at the end when they see the person looking sad or happy. So this is what really interests us. And as we can see here, participants mimic more when they feel closer to the smiling person. And this is 0, so they mimic just a lot less when they don't feel close. Now, this is people looking sad at the wedding, so they're deviant. And as we can see here, the scores are all 0 or below. So this is not no mimicry whatsoever. Here we could actually have something like sadness mimicry, because the reverse score would be congruent with sadness mimicry. But that would only occur for the people who are low if you're not feeling close to that person. And in fact, it's just very, very borderline. So it's more just to say they're simply not mimicking us. Now, what happens at funerals? Now, at funerals, we see closeness makes no difference. Actually, what we also see that people look already somewhat sad before they even see the person, which has something to do with seeing funerals seems to elicit sadness. But this is still different, and we see that they're actually mimicking the sad expressions. But there's no effect of closeness at all. Now, what about those deviant people who still think that those people who are happy at funerals are someone they can be close to? Well, if they're feeling close to the person who's happy at the funeral, they do mimic their expression. So for happiness, even if it's in an incongruent context, if you feel close to a person who smiles, you will mimic that person. Yes. For sadness, however, it really depends on the appropriateness of the expression. So if sadness is shown in a sad context, sadness will be mimicked, even if you don't feel particularly close to this person. And this is an interesting thing, and it matches something which I've found in other research that I've done with Shlomo Hareli on the social signal value of emotions. And now we have been looking with Andreas Garantino at appeal functions, and the appeal functions of sadness is really be empathetic. Yes, help me, be empathetic, feel with me. And it seems very much that people are just doing that. So if they see an appropriately sad person, they feel with them, even if they don't feel close to that person. So what these studies all show is that context has an impact, and also that context has a differential impact depending on what is the expression that is shown. So we find that happiness seems to be a very quintessential affiliative expression that elicits affiliation, whereas sadness seems to be an expression that is more something that elicits empathy, feeling with. Now, as I said, I have something else that I could talk about, because everybody lately asked me about this. And what happens if people are wearing masks? Okay, we tried to find out what happens when people are wearing masks. So this data is hot off the press. What we did, we have here people not wearing masks and people wearing masks. And they're either in a park or in a store. And there's some effects of that, but I'm not going to go into this right now. Mask wearing is more demanded in stores, so there's some difference with regard to what happens. But let's just look, first of all, what happens to the emotion recognition. Since the mask covers the face, we wonder how well people do recognize. Now, this is the intensity with which happiness is rated on happy expressions and sadness is rated on sad expressions. And you see for both of them, it is the case that the person wearing a mask the expression is rated less intensely. However, it's still rated at around 4 on a 7-point scale, so it's definitely being perceived, yes. It's just less intensely perceived. Now, less intensely can have an interesting effect, because this could mean that people perceive the affect of that person with the mask as relatively flat. And we know that people don't like flat affect in others. They often feel perturbed when they have the impression that the other person has a relatively flat affect. So that is one thing that might happen. We also see that interpersonal closeness is rated definitely lower when the face is covered with a mask, and in particular when it's covered with a mask and shows a sad expression, because even uncovered sad expressions are not perceived. People don't feel very close to a person who shows sadness. What happens with mimicry? Now we have, as you saw, that we first see the person's neutral expression, then an onset, and here's the apex. That's when you actually see the expression. And what you can see is that the red guys, they are not actually, that is when people are wearing a mask, they're actually not being mimicked. So if they show happiness and wear a mask, they're not mimicked. However, what happens when they show sadness and wear a mask? Now, when they show sadness and wear a mask, they are mimicked. Here you actually have a little offset, which may mean that there's two things going on. First of all, they're looking a little bit skeptical at a masked person in a park, because you don't need to wear masks in a park. So they might be critical, that might be, but then you still see it increases and it starts looking like sadness when the person actually shows an expression. Yes. And in the store, you very clearly see there's no difference between masked and unmasked people in terms of mimicry. So sad people are mimicked, happy people are not mimicked. So the other thing that is interesting is we also asked participants what their attitude towards mask wearing was, to what degree they endorsed mask wearing. And this is obviously a heavily social demand question. So nobody said that they were not absolutely not doing this. So we distinguish only between mild endorsement and strong endorsement. But what you can see, again, if we look at the degree of facial positivity when happy expressions are shown in the park or in the store, when people really endorse masks, there is more congruent expressivity than when they do it to a lesser degree. Yes, so attitude seems to have an impact, but only again for happy expressions. So for happy expressions, we find that mask wearing really reduces mimicry to non-existence if people are not heavily endorsing masks. If they're heavily endorsing masks, it reduces mimicry to quite a bit, but not out of existence. So this suggests that mask wearing is really important for that affiliative aspect of emotions, expressions. However, interestingly, again, for sadness, there's no difference. So sadness still appeals to being empathic, and people still are empathic, even if the mask wearer the sad person wears the mask. So together we see that social context has a strong top-down effect on mimicry. It seems to be largely mediated via changes in the attitude towards expressors. And this effect, however, is less pronounced or even absent for sad expressions, which seem to have a strong appeal function towards being empathic with the expressor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ursula, for this really interesting and also very topical specifically at the end presentation. So now it's time for questions from the audience, and again, you can type your questions in the Q&A box. But I was warned during during your talk, Ursula, that Christian already has a question, so let him go first.
Yeah.
Okay, if that's a warning, that if I want to ask something. Thank you a lot for the talk. It was super interesting. I wanted to ask about that funeral and wedding experiment.
Yeah.
What do you think is the role of just being surprised there by the expression? So so my first reaction in both cases was I was just laughing because the stimulus was so extreme, right? So the facial expression was so extreme, like almost comical. Yeah. At least it looked like to me like that. So what do you think is?
Well, since we measured DMG, we have a pretty good idea what they were doing, and they weren't doing much in the way of laughing at, for instance, the person who showed sadness in the happy context or something, or we didn't find that. They might have been surprised, but you know, these are fairly long stimuli, so they saw them for several seconds afterwards. So if there had been, so like say, a brief before they settle into something, we certainly didn't see that. Also, you have to understand this was a within participants design, so at some point they were aware that these are the expressions.
Right.
Okay, next question is from Sanne van Oosten. I find this a very relevant question because we struggle with this too. Do you find any gender differences in mimicry? If so, what are the causes?
Not really. There is in some studies, we usually have both men and women, and in some studies we find relatively smallish differences in which I would call a main effector. So it's a difference in offset. And because it's really a difference in offset, I personally think it has more to do with when you do use EMG with skin characteristics. You know, you have to put the electrodes over parts of the skin where there might be beard, especially for the zygomaticus, and here. And also even the eyebrows are more hairy in men than in women, and often more bushy, and are more present. So it might well be that what you're picking up is really a question of measurement more than anything in particular, because as I said, it's just like an offset. It's the main effect. It doesn't interact with anything. And it's small, so both of it, and it's so small that in most studies we don't find it. You have to go into those studies where we run 90 participants before you even see them.
So we would need more women with beards in order to test this.
Yes, we would need more women. And also, if I may say so, most women actually tend to exfoliate their skin more regularly. And we tend to get slightly better impedances on female skin than male skin.
Good to know. Thanks. Okay, next question from Mike Homan. Thanks, Ursula, for your great presentation. I have two questions. First, are the mimicry effects that you presented mostly unconscious mimicry, or do they also cross over to more conscious emotional contagion?
Well, the thing is that facial mimicry is really time-locked, and when we use the EMG, we can show this rather nicely. I mean, I showed a very rough segmenting, yes, where each segment was about a second or more. In other studies, we sometimes have the data segmented out in 100 millisecond bins, and you can really see that the mimicry starts at 300 to 500 milliseconds after stimulus onset. That is way below anything what a person can consciously do. So it has to be unconscious and spontaneous, because nobody can do that.
Okay, and our second question is, do you also see a gender effect of the expressor of the emotion?
We have occasionally looked at this. I think most recently we didn't. We stopped doing it because it gave us these things which are these really strange four-way interactions with all sorts of other things that nobody can tell you why male sadness expressions are mimicked more than female sadness expressions when the stimulus is shown for a longer time. These things, you know, what I would call a sporadic complex interactions, which are probably spurious. Nothing systematic that we found. We expected it because in our emotion recognition research, we always found that there is a difference how male and females expressions are perceived. So we definitely expected this, but it didn't pan out that way. We might want to do this for the weddings and funerals, actually, because there's a stronger social norm and women are supposed to be more norm conforming than men and such. So this might actually be an interesting thing to look at that data that way.
Okay, thanks. Next question is actually in the chat box. Please do write them in the Q&A box. But the question is from Shahira Sharaf. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Do you have looked at any cultural differences, particularly in the context of weddings and funerals?
No, we haven't. This study is fairly recent. We just did that last year. We haven't looked at any cultural differences there.
Okay. Next question then from Isabella Rabasso. Thanks a lot for your talk, very interesting. Maybe I simply missed this, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on interaction quality. How can this be conceptualized and measured?
Interaction quality, we had several questions. We asked them, how pleasant was this interaction? How satisfied were your interactions? How warm and appreciative was your interaction partner? These were the types of questions which we combined into one score, which we called interaction quality.
Okay, clear. So about that same figure, I had a question how you exactly constructed the mimicry index in that figure.
The mimicry index was usually when you look at, let me show you. Oops, no, I was too quick. That's no good here. Here, what you can see here is when a person shows a, say, positive facial expression, basically a smiley expression, you see the corrugators low and zygomaticus and oculi are high. And the converse is the case when people show frowny expressions, which could be either sadness or anger. Both are very difficult to distinguish with EMG. So we usually use the same. So what we do, we calculate a contrast score. And the contrast is corrugator minus the mean of these two. And they're all Z-scored. They're all within subject Z-scored. So you can just calculate with them. And so if the score is positive, then it means the person smiles. If the score is negative, the person shows either anger or sadness. So we calculated these scores, and this is actually the same thing we did with the open face scores. We did the same thing. We calculated those scores. So when you see facial positivity, that's how it was calculated. And then for the mimicry in this graph, what we did was that we simply correlated the scores over 10 millisecond bins for 100 millisecond bins for the two interaction partners. And then we averaged that, and then we took Fisher's, this is Fisher's R to Z correlation. What you see down here, the mimicry here is the Fisher's R to Z correlation for that. R to Z transform of that correlation.
Yeah. Clear.
I have a question. Could you tell us a little bit more about your experiences of using facial EMG to capture mimicry versus sort of the open smile, the open face software, and what the pros and cons are, and where you see this heading in the future?
Well, you see, for the weddings and funerals, we had 90 participants, and that was considered an extremely overpowered study, yes. For the study with open face, we had 200 participants. Of the 200 participants, we had 250 participants to begin with. Of the 250 participants, 51 or 2, we lost data from 50 odd because nothing could be uploaded at all. So those people we didn't. In the end, we had really good data from 165 participants. So essentially, the problem is, if you do this like that, if you do it online, the way you do this is you ask participants to set their webcam, to switch it on, to have it on. And then there's programs, and we actually use SOCI survey, which actually allows that can record the EMG. They could record the facial expression of the person or whatever the webcam sees, yes. Good. First of all, you have to upload what's recorded. First of all, the recording has to work. Then you have to upload the recording, yes. And this is where you often run into trouble. This simply doesn't work. There might be browser problems, there might be compatibility problems, there might be transmission problems. There are a fair number of participants where you simply don't get anything. Now, when you have the ones where you get something, you still lose on data because the open face program has to first find the head. Now, that's pretty good at this, but when people do things like this, yes, it's really difficult. And also, if they do things like this, there's facial occlusion, yes. So obviously you tell participants they're not supposed to do any such things, but you all have experience with what happens if you tell people not to do something. They may or may not do it, yes. So in the end, you lose quite a few of these sequences because people are doing things they're not supposed to do. They look sideways, they have their face occluded, the cat is running through the picture. We have that also. You have all sorts of things that happen. And so, yes, you can do it. And once you have the data, you have an enormous amount of data. And the data wrangling is really interesting. I mean, we analyzed this, as you can see, with R, and we ran into real problems because simply of the humongousness of the resulting data files. So let's put it like this. You have to, it's a lot of work. It's not something that's face validly easier than doing the EMG study. But it can be done. And since online studies, you have much less recruiting problems, you can actually run this fairly quickly. I mean, running the study is not, we did that, and the running we did in less than a week. But then comes the exciting part. And
but so could I ask a follow-up question? Have you assessed the sort of the validity of the results that you get with the two different with the facial the EMG measures versus the open face software? Have other people done that? So you're confident that you pick up mimicry in a valid and reliable way?
Well, the thing is, there's this paper by Eva Krumhuber, and she says, well, you can't use it. And that's not quite true. I mean, we have done a study, parametric study a few years back using face reader and EMG on the same person. So we had the same person. Concurrently, we use the face reader, and we also ran it through, we use EMG and we ran it through face reader, and the correlations were quite decent. So 0.6-ish, 0.7-ish, and 0.9-ish, depending It was dependent on participants, which is not surprising. So it's decent, but, and here I would put a big but. You see, when what you saw was something called facial positivity, facial negativity. That's all I would agree on. All of these programs are fairly decent at detecting smiles. They're actually often really good at, Open Face is very good at detecting smiles. Open Face is also fairly decent at detecting frowns. Anything else is a toss-up. Yeah, I wouldn't look at mimicry of fear expressions or mimicry of disgust expressions using Open Face. Yeah. You get overall facial positivity and overall facial negativity quite nicely. That's what you can do. But then EMG, many people only use corrugator and zygomaticus either. So, you know, it's no different than having a very reduced EMG set. But I would be very, very worried at this stage to go into any emotion that requires more than zygomaticus and corrugator for its detection.
Okay, that's all very good to know. There's another question. Martijn Schoonvelde, University College Dublin. Very interesting research, and these treatment videos are amazing. Yeah, I must say this is the best cat video I've ever seen. This is truly truly great.
Well, cats can't move their eyebrows, so it's actually an animated cat video.
Odd question perhaps, but with us not being able to recognize each other's emotions with face masks, will people compensate somehow to signal their emotional states?
Well, the thing is, people often say you can't recognize, but as you could see, they can. I mean, even the sadness with the mask was rated as more than 4. So this is a very decent intensity rating. So they surely saw the sadness. There's no problem with that. Also, if you actually interact with someone, there's so many more signals. I mean, voice. When I smile, you can hear that. Yes. You don't have to see it. You can hear it. You know, there's this old research by Tartar in 1984. He actually makes that point with regard to telephone conversations. Yes, you can absolutely hear a smile. And the year later, she had a paper where she shows you can also typically hear a frown because there's more tension in the face overall. And that is also relevant for the vocal system. So you can actually hear that. So yes, you can hear it in the voice. You can see it in the body posture. People also, and that is anecdotal evidence, claim that they're trying to smile harder so as to be better perceived. So people can compensate quite a bit. I mean, if you have, the thing is, there's this old research from the 70s that shows that people having the choice between different channels prefer the face. They prefer face information, and they're preferentially treat face information. We're very much focused on the face. Humans look at each other's faces. But when we're deprived of facial information, we do really well with the other channels. So they can.
There's still hope for us, even with face masks. Yeah.
Yes.
Can we then also train this, Ursula? Can we become better as the pandemic lasts long in sort of recognizing other signals? And can we become better at signaling this to other people?
Well, actually, when we looked at this emotion intensity as a function of that relatively crude attitude measures, the people who have a positive attitude to much perceive emotions more intensely. So actually, that might already be something that feeds back into how you look at mask. People who are better able maybe to detect emotions despite the mask have a less negative view of them, because it's for them, it's less of a problem. And surely people learn. I mean, It is just that it feels better being able to see the face. Yes, in our culture, we are strongly conditioned towards wanting to see the face. That is also cultural. There's cultures that don't really have that requirement as much. But in our culture, we're strongly conditioned to wanting to see the face and to wanting to use the face information. We cannot do without, no problem.
And to what extent can we consciously learn to change our expressions? Like for example, with actors, how conscious is that process of having more extreme expressions? Or
well, I don't know. I mean, many of our interactions that are superficial, so not between people who know each other, are also very scripted. So, for instance, you smile and greeting. You can certainly train yourself to smile more in greeting, because when someone like me who lived for 20 years in North America, I have certainly learned to smile more in greeting than I used to when I was living in Germany.
yeah, but that's a very unconscious process, right?
You learn it with, it's an unconscious process, but you learn it, and you can also try yourself, to and people claim that they do this, yes, that they realize that maybe their smile wasn't seen, and so they're checking it up a little bit afterwards.
Yeah. So in this talk, you've talked about mimicking anger or sadness, happiness. Are there any other emotions that we can recognize in the face that are being mimicked?
Yeah. Hard to say. Much of mimicry research is limited by the fact that a large number of researchers uses two electrodes, corrugator and zygomaticus, and that's what they get. There is some of my own, some by others, that has used additional muscles like frontalis for fear or levator for disgust. And it's yin is the answer. So, for instance, with disgust, we found that we always thought people don't really mimic disgust, but then we did a study, a very large study with 100 group that does mimic disgust, and that's a subgroup of the highly neurotic participants. So participants high in neuroticism were actually mimicking disgust, whereas the others were not mimicking disgust.
There was a little glitch when you talked about the number of respondents.
We had 160 respondents because
okay.
we were looking at individual differences.
Yeah.
And there we found a subset of individuals that mimic disgust, and these were the ones that were high in neuroticism. So yes, maybe people do mimic disgust, but maybe not everyone mimics disgust. Fear mimicry we have found sporadically in research, but these were not studies that were powered to the degree that we could have used individual difference measures. So all I can say is, now you see it, now you don't. And that is true for other researchers as well.
It's a bit of a partly reflection on my non-academic life, but so I have 3 small kids, and so I have the sense that I'm constantly trying to learn them also to recognize emotions, and that in the books they read, there's a lot of sort of is this animal angry or happy, and so it's been reading up a little bit on some of these American programs where they are actually in the classroom are trying to teach children a richer or more sort of like Lisa Feldman-Barrett talks about granularity, sort of a richer recognition of specific emotions. Are people that are better have a richer sort of vocabulary and a richer set of emotions that they can recognize and learn to display? Are they better at mimicking other people's expressions?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think anybody ever looked at that. We know that it is useful for people to be better able to recognize others' emotions. We also know it's useful for people to have a richer emotional vocabulary, to be able to make finer distinctions. All of this has positive impact on the quality of the everyday interactions. Does it make a difference for mimicry? I don't know.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah. Well. Yeah. It was just. But is it true that we as parents are actively trying to teach our children this constantly? Is that a thing that?
Well, yeah. No. Well, let's put it like this. Nowadays, yes. Older studies suggest that girls have always been taught about emotions. So there's some research also from the 70s going back, suggesting that mothers, for instance, tell their daughters, look, this little girl is sad, you should go and be nice to her. This is an example out of one of those papers, yes? But mothers were not doing this with boys nearly as much or at all. And fathers weren't doing it at all. So this is a cultural difference. Nowadays, both parents tell both groups of children these things to alert them to emotion expressions and to give them information about these emotion expressions.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, Ursula, it's almost 4 o'clock. I'm gonna take the opportunity to thank you for this fascinating talk, and it's been a pleasure to finally meet you. Somebody who's been reading a lot of work in the last years. It's great to have you around us. We'll definitely have you over in Amsterdam. Maybe something joined with Agneta's psychology or emotion group at some point when this is more possible again. So I want to thank the participants for the engaging questions, and I also want to take the opportunity to announce a couple of talks for the coming week. So next week, Friday, is the last Friday of the month. So then we have graduate students, this time not 2, but even 3. So the session is also half an hour longer. So we run from 3 to 4:30. We have Tobias Rohrbach, Lara Muradova, and our own Maaike Hohmann on various topics related to emotion recognition in politicians and reflection. In December 4th, we have Marieke van der Velde, who will present new joint work with Maurits Meijers on obviously on something related to compromise. December 13th, we have Patrick Stewart, also on facial expressions. And then on December 20th, just before the Christmas break, we have again Maaike Hohmann with a study on facial mimicry, and we have John Sengis from Temple University on some of the sort of hope and other positive emotions in the domain of politics. And then we'll go for a little Christmas break, and in the coming weeks we'll Gijs and I have been putting together the program for the spring, and that looks really exciting, so we'll update you on that soon. I want to wish you all a pleasant weekend already, and hope to see you again next week.